Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to those watching live stream. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Luigi Zingales, the Faculty Director of the Stigler Center, and we're very happy to host today Professor Tarek Hassan for a two-day mini course on economic analysis using text. Thank you very much, Tarek, for joining us. And today's topic is sources and transmissions of country risk. But before we start, I want to give you a little bit of warnings and some news. So first of all, we are on the record and live streaming. So please silence your phones, and but feel free to use social media as much as you want. As usual, the views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. So Tarek, you can say whatever you want. As you may know, the Stigler Center supports and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, including our podcast, Capitalism, that I co-host with Bethany McLean, and our online publication, promarket.org, so please check them out. We also encourage you to join us for a webinar on April the 5th on anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine and the role of the media. And sign up to watch our flagship antitrust conference later in April. All the information is on the Stigler Center webpage. Back to this afternoon, we look forward to hearing Tarek's insights, and he will also answer questions at the end. His full bio is on the center's website, but before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce him. He is a professor of economics at Boston University. His research focuses on international and macrofinance, as well as social factors in economic growth. Some of his recent papers study the effect of uncertainty on firm behavior and on the allocation of capital across countries. His work has appeared in top economic journals, and his research, if you want to keep up with his current research, is on the MBR and CPR working paper. He taught at Harvard and also was a colleague of mine here at Booth. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tarek Hassan.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back here. I've actually I gave one of these many years ago, and they made fabulous photos during the talk, and it's still on my website today. So if you go to my website, and I'm sure you see me pointing at a Stigler event. So why am I here? I would say about 10 years ago, here at Booth, a small and very quiet revolution in economics started. At the time, none of us knew it was going on. In various corners of economics, people started using text for economic analysis. So maybe the people who are most famous for this are Jesse Shapiro and Matt Gensko. At the same time, we had Matt Taddy here and Brian Kelly, who kind of pioneered applications in finance. And my little part of this is essentially introducing text as a means for economic analysis about macroeconomics and firms. So firms produce an awful lot of text. Most of the macroeconomic analysis that research institutions do is based on the numbers that firms produce every quarter. Like earnings releases and the number of people hired and the number of dollars earned and all of that. But as it turns out, firms produce a lot more text than they do numbers. And the numbers are all about the past. So they tell you how many people they hired last quarter, how much money they made last quarter, how much depreciation they have in the business. The text, as you will see, are much more about what's happening now and what will happen in the future. And my prediction is that standard economic surveillance, understanding what's going on around you, both for research institutions and also for firms trying to understand what their competitors are doing, we're going to start using text in the same way that we're using numbers today. And this paper is one example of how you can learn from text things that are really impossible or buried very deeply in the numbers. So this paper is about sources and transmission of country risk, and I'll give you sort of an abbreviated version of what I would be presenting in a seminar to the other professors. So if you've taken a class on international finance, you might know that global perceptions of risk are viewed as a major driver of important things like capital flows, investment decisions, and contagion, financial panic, that sort of thing. Things that really can affect economic outcomes for entire countries. What we do in this paper, so what's kind of difficult about that subject is that it's generally a little hard to measure perceptions of risk, and specifically, it's hard to measure how much risk people associate with a given country at a given point in time. So what we do in this paper is we use textual analysis of firm-level texts that firms around the world produce, to measure the risk that managers and investors at large firms, in particular at firm I, associate with country C at time t. So the key variable I'm going to generate is going to be how much risk does a company like Emerson is based in the US, associate with a country like Turkey at a given point in time. And that risk perception might affect how Emerson acts vis-a-vis its businesses in Turkey. Once we have this sort of firm country time level measure of risk, we can flexibly aggregate it to measure the risk that a set of firms associate with country C at time t. So for example, I'm going to be able to separately measure the risk that American financial firms associate with Turkey and the risk that American engineering firms associate with Turkey. And we can see which of these perceptions is more important for things like capital flows. We're going to be able to see the transmission of risk from each origin to each destination. So we can look at how are risks from the Ukraine invasion transmitted to firms around the world, for example. We can look at foreign risk perceived by a given firm at a given point in time, and then also just a time series of global risk, which I will show you. So what we're going to do is I'm first going to try and focus on identifying spikes in country risks. So spikes in country risk are commonly called crises. And these crises, as we've seen with Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic and all that, they can happen overnight, much faster than accounting data. These data here appear at the quarterly level, so also not quite as fast. But we're going to be able to systematically say, where is there a crisis and what is the crisis about? So we're going to be able to document the stated source and pattern of transmission of that crisis to foreign firms. The second, or maybe most important finding here is that the transmission pattern of risks, so if there's a crisis in a given country, how does that affect other countries? That depends crucially on what kind of crisis are we talking about. So there's going to be different types of crises that transmit in very different ways. I'm going to have a way of saying that, for example, financial crises transmit in a very different way than natural disasters. We find that a spike in perceived country risk, so particular by foreign financial firms, so if US financial institutions decide a given foreign country is very risky, then that's associated with significant falls in the stock prices in that country, a depreciation of the currency, capital outflows, and reductions in firm-level investment and employment. In other words, I'm going to show you some evidence that the risk perceptions of important firms, like US financial firms, seem to materially affect outcomes in faraway countries. And in a way we knew about this because sort of leaders of emerging markets often walk around international conferences and complain that for no reason at all, or the sentiment of foreign firms is affecting outcomes in their country. You have capital flight and so forth. I'm not sure about the no reason at all, but it does seem that there is something to that. That the perceptions of important firms, in particular financial firms, seem to affect allocations in faraway places. Okay. So let me kind of first, so really most of this paper is about measurement and how to think about country risk. And let me give you some of that. And you might be surprised, if you go online, you find lots of like measures and assessments of country risk, but there actually is kind of very little scientific work on the subject. So here's our data source. So we're going to have English language earnings calls from firms in 81 countries. So I'm going to think about like 7,000 firms per quarter. And basically what this data set is it's almost all listed firms in the US and the UK are going to have earnings calls in English. But more importantly, almost all important large firms in other countries also do that. So we're going to have conversations of firms that typically, for a typical emerging market, are still going to cover something like 90% of the market capitalization of the local stock market. There are typically 4 calls per year. And the way that this works is a firm, they calculate their earnings, and then they release their earnings in a press release. And then the firm's management jumps on the phone with their analysts. And if you're unfamiliar with this is the thing that Elon Musk gets in trouble for all the time. Right? So this is like you have your earnings. Now you need to explain to your investors what on earth is going on and what you're planning. And it's actually a freewheeling conversation. Like the lawyers are sitting there, like trying to keep the CEO from saying stupid things. But it's actually a fairly open discussion. The management first gives a presentation, and then there's questions by analysts, and then hopefully the management answers. So what we're trying to measure is how much time do executives and investors at firm I, in the call of firm I in quarter T, spend discussing risks associated with country C in quarter T. Yeah, so for example, in an ideal data set, I would have a research assistant who sits there with a stopwatch, like how many sentences did they spend talking about risks in Turkey? Okay, so that's a measure of how much is that preoccupying their brains, risks in Turkey. So that's the central variable, country risk I, like risks perceived in country C by firm I at time T. And firm I's are based in 81 different countries. Does that make sense so far? By the way, I'm very used to being interrupted, so if you have any questions, you may interrupt me with any questions.
Yeah, actually one question. So if you made this by the time that is spent, does that also represent a kind of disagreement between these two parties? That's why they spend so much time discussing that issue.
Well, so you can sort of think about this. So as academics, we're very used to this idea that like our work is going to get scrutinized. I know that like my referees are going to complain about things when I write a paper, and it's a bit like that, right? So the CEO knows that there's certain things on the analyst's mind, and will probably you can think about it like as in game theory, like if I don't bring it up in my presentation, they're going to ask me about it. Yeah. So that's how I think about that. All right, so how are we going to do this? So we want to do this in a way that kind of treats all countries the same and is fast. So the way we're going to do this is we're using training libraries. So for each of 45 of the 45 largest economies in the world, I'm going to assemble a training library. And the set of word combinations in that training library for country C, I'm going to call big TC. So these training libraries come for essentially just the Economist Intelligence Unit country reports. So they write every year like a report about the regulatory environment in different countries. Each country has a report. It's a couple of pages long. And we're using the text so they write about Turkey. We take all the text and throw it on one pile. They write about Germany. We take all the text, throw it on one pile, and so on. So, and this is, I promise, the only piece of math. So B is a 2-word combination. So don't ask me why we're using 2-word combinations. That's kind of a standard thing in natural language processing. So just accept that for a second, but it doesn't matter whether you want 2-word or 1-word combination, basically. So what we want is we want to kind of estimate the probability that a 2-word combination, like for example, Angela Merkel, if I say Angela Merkel, what's the probability that I'm talking about Germany? So what's the probability when you hear a given 2-word combination that 2-word combination is about a given foreign country? And there's many fancy ways of doing it, but like the easiest way, kind of from chapter 2 in the natural language processing textbook, is called TF-IDS. And that's basically say, look at how frequent Angela Merkel is in the training library for Germany, very. And interact it with a penalty function. Okay, so how frequent is Angela Merkel in Germany if it's in the text for Germany? If it's quite frequent, then it means that that two-word combination is strongly associated with Germany. And then the second term here is a penalty function. So if all other country training libraries also contain the word Angela Merkel, then I'm going to downweight that. Yeah, so this second thing here basically is a punishment. So for example, Federal Reserve. Americans talk a lot about Federal Reserve, but everybody in the world talks a lot about Federal Reserve. So if I hear Federal Reserve, it actually doesn't help me all that much in figuring out whether I'm talking about the United States or not. So you can think about this as like a cheap way of figuring out the probability that a given two-word combination is associated with a given foreign country, and this is what you get, right? So for Turkey here, for example, so if you hear Turkey or Turkish and capital T, not lowercase t, then it's quite likely that you're talking about Turkey, and then the other things are the Gazette number, Turk ex impank Ankara, official Gazette of Turkey. Are there any Turks in the room? Yeah, so if you know anything about Turkey, these are kind of pretty intricate institutional details associated with Turkey, like not that intricate, but the name of the currency, the name of important regulators in the country, the names of political figures, the names of places, and so forth, all come out in the wash here. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, you said though that it's a two-word combination, but some of those are one word.
Yeah, let's not get into that. It doesn't matter whether it's one or two. We married the two together. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't have. I was saying it, and then I was like, oh, wait, I shouldn't have said that. Okay. All right, great. So basically, like, all I need you to follow so far is like, I have a way of coming up with a probability that a given phrase, which could be one or two words, is associated with a given foreign country, and the winner, of course, is usually the name of the country and its variance. All right, so now what are we going to construct? The main thing we're going to construct is this country risk ICT variable. Okay, so that's going to be the main thing, and then everything else is actually pretty easy. So now what am I going to do? So I'm going to go and I'm going to look for, one second. I'm going to look, so let's say I want to construct the risk that firm I, let's say Emerson, associates with Turkey in quarter T. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to go and look for all mentions of Turkey, all kind of omega Turkey, omega, all phrases that have an omega that's positive for Turkey. Yeah, so if they say Turkey or Turkish or Ankara. And then I'm going to look 10 words before and after that mention of Turkey and see if they say anything about risk or uncertainty. So the way to think about this is I'm now basically counting the number of sentences that they spend talking about risks in Turkey. And that's going to be my measure, country risk ICT. Before a question, I have one more thing. Now, in the same way, we can measure, are they talking about risks in Turkey? We can go and measure, are they talking about happy or sad things that are happening in Turkey to them? So there is established libraries in economics where we have a list of like positive words like profit, fantastic, great, and negative words, bankruptcy, terrible, depressing. And in the same way that we go and look for sentences that discuss risks associated with Turkey, we can go look for sentences that say happy things about Turkey or sad things about Turkey. And we're going to take the happy sentences about Turkey minus the sad sentences about Turkey and construct country sentiment of Emerson as it relates to Turkey at time t. So this is quite important because it allows you to separate what we call first and second moment impacts. First moment is something bad happened in Turkey. Second moment is, oh, there's now a lot of risk associated with our operations in Turkey. So think about the mean, and the variance is the risk variable. And then finally, as a sense check, you can also just look at how much are they talking about Turkey without looking for risk or positive or negative things. So that's the country exposure. And that's it. OK, so there was a question.
I was just wondering about the TF-IDF measurement value, because you described it as like probability, but the numbers were greater than 1.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, so if you want if you want to calculate a real probability, you have to use fancier econometrics, and they require you to butcher the text. So they call it dimensionality reduction, which basically means you have to throw out most of the words that ever occur. You can do it with you can use this called multinomial inverse regression. Yeah, it's great bedtime reading. And that will actually give you something between 0 and 1 that like an econometrician would call a probability. I kind of don't really care all that much because for my purposes, whatever method you use to assign the probabilities doesn't really matter all that much. Like, I guess the main thing I want to say is that if you have a method for generating these words, where you tie your hands, often, as you saw for the Turkish example, you get word combinations that are not so obvious, right? So all I want to stress is, like, if you want to do something like this by yourself, don't sit down and say, oh, I'm now going to meditate and think about what are words associated with Turkey. You're going to do a terrible job. All right, so yeah, question?
Yeah, so I understand from the transcription you factorize the words and then you measure the sentiment analysis. So I just want to know, how do you make sure that, because with sentiment analysis often there are like context-specific biases. For example, I cannot accurately score like...
So let me stop you right there. So there is a lot of literature about sentiment analysis, a lot. And people have a lot of opinions about sentiment analysis. People also have a lot of opinions about how to calculate these probabilities. I don't really care so much about either of these two things, mainly because I just need a way of like controlling are happy or sad things happening in the country. And what was the other thing I wanted to say? Yeah, and basically you're going to see this is a big data application, so lots of things are washed out. Why is everybody writing about sentiment, by the way? There's a huge industry on Wall Street where what they do, and this is like the closest thing that existed before we started doing this work. The transcript of the earnings call comes out. They send it to a bunch of like signal providers or whatever they're called. They have some kind of algorithm goes over the text. Most of the time it's just a sentiment score. They send the sentiment score to the high-frequency trader, and the high-frequency trader trades. This is not what we're interested in here, right? So what we're interested in here is we want to actually like get to the meaning of the sentence, and specifically not the whole transcript, but we want to say what are they saying about Turkey. Okay, so I need to speed up a little bit, so I'm going to postpone questions for a minute there. Okay, I hope that made some sense. So you can again check that this works. So countries that firm I talks a lot about, well, tends to be their own headquarter country, tends to be countries where they export to, tends to be countries where they do some business. Okay, so that makes sense. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I can now aggregate. So remember, the star of the show is country risk ICT. And now I can just take averages of country risk in different ways to measure important different concepts. So the first is just what is the overall, what's the average risk perception associated with Turkey in quarter T? So I just take all of my 11,000 firms in my sample and look at, on average, how many sentences do I have about risks in Turkey? And then I plot the time series, and I'll show you those in a second. So that's, with one click, your Python code runs. You generate a measure of country risk generated from microdata, from firm-level discussions, for each of 45 countries. What's kind of an interesting twist here is I can now say I'm going to take the average of only specific sets of firms. So I could say, for example, I'm going to look at only the risk perceptions of Turkey by foreign financial firms, or by foreign firms in certain other sectors, or I'm going to look at only the risk perceptions of European firms of Ukraine. Yeah, so this is a fairly flexible thing that you can decompose in all kinds of different directions. The second thing is the transmission of risk from each origin to each destination. I can now go to German firms, a destination, and look at how much are they talking about risks coming from Turkey. And I'm going to call that the transmission of risk from Turkey to German firms. So it makes visible a transmission of risk across borders, what we weren't able to do before. Yeah, so people sometimes call this contagion, where risk comes from one part of the world and pops up in another part of the world. This is one way of measuring it systematically. OK, so now let me kind of describe a little bit what's going on. We've now pressed enter, and the Python code runs, and we have this whole data set ready. Now I'm just going to show you what it says. Yeah?
Is your corpus of training documents all English language? Or?
Yes. So I mentioned this initially. Essentially, all really large firms in the world that are listed, a large majority of them has their calls in English, either because they sit down and talk in English, or because there's various different ways in which it's translated. So it might be that a Japanese CEO is not comfortable presenting in English, and then there will be a translation on the call by an interpreter. Or it might be that the call is actually held in Chinese, and then Thomson Reuters translates it into English. Yeah, so there's no like uniform rule, but the fact is that the world financial markets converge here. Investors seem to be making their judgments in English, which is why firms cater to that, large firms. Yeah? Small firms, not so much. OK, so let me talk about sources of country risk. So the first thing I want to show you, and this is, you don't really need to look at the math. This is maybe not super surprising, is that when a country's risk perception, country's risk ticks up, its stock returns go down. OK, so when it looks like a country's entering a crisis, its stock prices depreciate, and this is true even if you control for the mean. Okay, so there's often a question about like, is a given event in a foreign country affecting things abroad? Like, remember like Brexit? The French were all about, oh, we need to like get Brexit over because the risk coming from Brexit, the country risk UK experienced by French firms is really disrupting them. This here's a way of distinguishing the effects that are coming from risk, from the variance, from them saying there's risk associated with the UK, from there's good or bad news, like Brexit is terrible for us. So good news about the country, stock price goes up. More risk associated with the country, stock price goes down. And this is also when you look at realized volatility of the stock price, when they talk more about a country's riskiness, the realized volatility of that country goes up. If you're a nerd like me, you're really proud that this is not significant. Okay? All right. So now, let me just show you some pictures. What you see here in gray is the country risk associated with Greece over time. The first thing I want you to notice, if you know anything about Greece, and I'd say like 2010 and 2012, this kind of looks about right. There was a massive sovereign debt crisis in Greece at the time. And so there are very clear Greek-specific features in this time series. The second thing I want you to notice, if you've ever kind of written a term paper and you've kind of had like a time series, and you were trying to figure out why is it high at a given point, you might have gone to Wikipedia to say, what happened in Greece in 2011? You don't need to do that here. Why? This graph is generated by text, so it is basically a self-labeling graph. You don't need to guess about why is there a spike in Greek country risk in the second quarter of 2010. Instead, what you can do is you can sort the pieces of text that generated this spike and read them. And it will say, there is a bailout coming from the Troika. We need a bailout from the Troika. And it will say things like, there are concerns related to possible impact of Greek Eurozone exit. That has led to persistent volatility. Okay, so you see exactly what this is about. The second thing I want you to notice is that there's gray and yellow. The yellow are risk perceptions of Greece by foreign financial firms. The gray are risk perceptions of Greece by other non-financial foreign firms. And what you see is that this is very clearly a financial crisis. All the variation is basically coming from the yellow, which is not true for COVID here, for example. So compare this to a flood disaster in Thailand, where the yellow is totally flat. Yeah, it's not a financial concern, but it's a real concern for supply chains of Japanese firms if there's a flood in Thailand. Okay, so it gives us a way of learning about why are there different crises. This is the time series of global risk that you get from these discussions of managers and earnings. So basically, this is the average country risk across countries. There are kind of three features here: the global financial crisis, the COVID pandemic, and also almost significant, almost at the 2 standard deviation threshold, is the European sovereign debt crisis. Okay, I'm going to call these gray ones global crises to distinguish them from local crises. Now let me talk about local crises. Remember, we have this for each of 45 countries. So I have a time series that looks like that for each of 45 countries. Just to structure our conversation, I'm going to say I'm going to look at all the peaks that are more than 2 standard deviations in the time series. And I'm going to call those a crisis. I'm going to give them a name. How am I going to give them a name? Well, remember that these graphs are self-labeling. So I can always go to the underlying text and think of what were they talking about. So for Brazil, you get Lula's election in 2002. Those of you remember, there were lots of upheaval for that. And then the corruption scandals of 2015. And of course, COVID. For Ireland, you get the European sovereign debt crisis and Brexit. For Egypt, you get the Egyptian revolution. Yeah? So one important thing that this here shows is that there's lots of bad things happen in Egypt. Well, my family is from Egypt originally. Lots of bad things happen in Egypt all the time. So this is not an index of bad things happening. This is an index of risk as perceived by global firms. Okay? And something can be risky for global firms either because something's really important is happening there or because you're really involved in the country. Yeah? So there's a real notion of some countries are driving variation in global risk because bad things happen there and lots of people are involved with the country. Whereas, a flood disaster in Mozambique will not show up because there are no global firms engaged in Mozambique. Yeah? Japan, nothing ever happens except for Fukushima. China, here you see really this feature, right? So China is becoming more and more important. There's more and more spikes in the China series, and these are largely economics. So risk of downturn, economic uncertainty, market volatility, then you get the Trump trade war. And then you start, and what's kind of fun about this is both the global financial crisis was first a local crisis according to our definition in the US, and then became a global crisis. For the same way, the COVID crisis was first a local crisis in China, and then it became a global crisis. All right, so you get the idea. UK, Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. Russia, I have an updated graph for that one. US, start of global financial crisis, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, S&P downgrade. I guess we're trying this one again soon. Okay. So that's it. So you can do this for 45 countries, and this is what you get. Hong Kong protest, Italian sovereign debt crisis, Green Revolution. This is kind of interesting, right? So none of our firms, no Iranian firms hold earnings calls in English, right? Why is this up here anyway? Well, because there are Japanese firms that are doing business with Iran that are worried about the Green Revolution. Mexico, very worried about Trump risks for a while. Okay, here we go. Okay, so now let me kind of show you some, okay, question?
Is this something that you're now currently monitoring regularly?
So, I'm glad you brought that up. So, coming out of this research, we actually have a spin-out startup that I'm going to have one slide up in the end. Various central banks and also a big consulting company have adopted these methods since we've kind of worked on them. We have a software tool that helps do it without any summation signs and other things. So yes, we are helping various institutions roll this out in practice, and then of course it's updated. Updating my slides, on the other hand, that is no. Yeah.
Wondering how frequently you get information from the countries because they try to keep it under wraps for a long time. So can something like this help the world get
So
to know
what
about
you're
things?
getting is largely foreigners' perceptions of what is going on in that country, right? So if some people have an inkling and others don't, then yes. So there certainly is so let me show you here these graphs about transmission of countries because it gets somewhat to what you're thinking about is can I analyze in real time how a crisis is spreading across borders. So let me warm up. I'll get there in 2 slides. So the first question, and this is kind of I guess mainly interesting from an academic perspective. So how much risk is transmitted from each origin to each destination country on average? So in normal times, how much risk are German firms actually getting from Turkey, for example? So I can go and take some averages and speak to that. But let me, instead of showing you a regression, let me just kind of show you the top 5 sources of US countries' perceived risk. And this is just kind of the hit list. US firms are most worried about what's happening in Canada, China, Mexico, Japan, and Brazil. Canadian firms are most worried about what's happening in the US, China, Mexico, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Chinese firms are most worried about Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Greek firms most worried about Belgium. Oh, sorry, the other way around. So firms that worry most about China are in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. That's the other direction here. Firms that worry most about Greece are in Belgium, Austria, Italy, France, and Spain. So if you've taken a trade course, you know what this is called. What is this called? It's called gravity. Okay, so it kind of means how much something in another part of the world affects you is determined basically by 2 things, which one is how big is the country, and the other is how far is it away. And then you also see the effects of colonial links and so trade economists are very happy about this because this is yet another thing that you can describe by what we call economic gravity. All right, so I said not too much math, but you know. Okay, let me kind of show you one more thing. So we then wanted to know, so basically, there's sort of, I guess what I want you to take from it is there's sort of an orderly pattern of risk transmission in the normal course of business. Okay, so it's not like we can get rid of all the risk, but instead, even when there's not a crisis, there's still going to be some risks that come, like operational risks or whatever, that come from Turkey to German firms. Why? Because Germany has strong ties with Turkey, lots of business being done with Turkey. Now the point is that during a crisis, this transmission pattern can differ dramatically from this normal orderly transmission of risk. And I'm going to show you ways of seeing that visually and also of quantifying it. And this goes to discussions of what people have called contagion. Yeah, so famously, you know, a Russian default in the 90s affected terrible economic fallout in South America. And people call that contagion because it's kind of hard to understand why is this risk from Russia popping up on the other side of the planet, and often people kind of say, oh, it's irrational or whatever. Let me first kind of show you a way of making it visible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to project, I'm going to run a regression of the transmission of risk from a given country that is in crisis, country O, to all the destination countries in the crisis period. And I'm going to project that on the normal transmission of risk. And let me just show you what this looks like. So the left here is for the global financial crisis of 2008. It is risk perception, so US risks, as perceived by all firms in foreign countries in our sample. And what I'm doing here is I'm plotting how much risk are you associating with the US today, so this is the first quarter of 2008, I think, compared to how much risk do we usually associate with the US. So firms that are in countries that do a lot of business with the US are going to be over here. And firms that are in countries that usually do relatively less business with the US are going to be on the left. The 45-degree line is how much risk you get normally from that origin. So what do we get? Okay, so for example, Japan is here. Okay, so they have more risks in 2008 that they're importing from the US relative to the normal times. And now we can look at what this cloud looks like. The global financial crisis has 2 important features that we can make visible here now. One is, where is the median country? How far is it above the 45-degree line? What's the distance of this cloud relative to the 45-degree line, which is a measure for the global impact of the crisis? how much are global firms worried about what's going on in this country? And for the global financial crisis, quite a bit. Okay, so in fact, the global financial crisis is the crisis with the largest global impact by that measure in our sample. Okay, we didn't fiddle this, it just came out as the biggest one. And you can see that all countries are above the 45-degree line and pretty far above the 45-degree line. The second thing I want you to note is that here for the global financial crisis, it's just a parallel shift, basically. Everybody's just worrying more about the US. Doesn't matter how far away you are or how much risk you usually import from the US, everybody's worried about it. Okay? So, the second biggest crisis by measure of like how far are the dots above the 45-degree line was the start of the COVID pandemic in the first quarter of 2020. Here you see a different pattern. All the dots are above the 45-degree line. Everybody's really worried about COVID. But there was disproportionate, now think back to like first quarter 2020, right? In the beginning, we thought, oh, this is going to be like SARS. It's going to affect Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore much more than other places, right? So you see here a slope that is bigger than 1, meaning that if you're normally more worried about China, you're also much more disproportionately more worried about this crisis, and this is what we call our measure of bilateral transmission. Okay, so now we have two things. One is how far is each dot above the 45-degree line? That's the global impact. You fit a regression line to that. If that is steep, it means high bilateral impact. Here are the two crises with the highest bilateral transmission in our sample. So these are the Thai floods. Okay? Basically what this here means is firms in Singapore and Japan and Taiwan are really worried about the Thai floods, but the Europeans couldn't care less. Okay, so they're basically on the 45-degree line. I apologize, like these axes are not the same, right? So you need to sort of look at them. Interestingly, and this is a big difference between, so why was the global financial crisis of 2008 so different from the European sovereign debt crisis? The global financial crisis, like everybody was losing their minds everywhere in the world. Really far, places really far away. Contrast this with the European sovereign debt crisis, where like it's basically global transmission's really low, pretty close to the 45-degree line, but very high bilateral transmission to other EU member countries.
They're the ones that are mainly affected.
Exactly. Yeah. So it gives you a way of systematically distinguishing crises that are spilling over to everywhere in the world and crises that are just spilling over to your neighborhood, basically. Do you have a question? Do we need the microphone?
Yeah. If there was a country lying on the red line below the intersection, what would that represent?
It means that they care less than they usually do. That's kind of hard to find. If there's like a crisis, like something terrible happens somewhere in a foreign country, and you talk about it even less than you usually do. Yeah.
Are there the opposite of like a crisis where there's like, you know, human development indices that are improving or some sort of government changes that are making people
so you could do this
feel
for
like
sentiment.
there's less of a crisis?
So you're right. So here I'm picking the time periods and I'm plotting basically changes in perceived risk. Using our methods, you can do changes in, like, you can basically do like, you can go to time periods where you have good news and bad news. Yeah, that's going to be, and then look at like how much happier or sadder are they about that country. So we can do that too. We haven't done that, but with the data we've generated, you can do that. Okay, and then last thing I wanted to show you is like regular versus irregular crisis transmission. So basically, it's a bit hard because my slides are scrunched up. I don't know if you've noticed, like they're. So if you look at this, I'm sorry. I'm going back up. So just look at this like from far away. So there's two crises. One is the Hong Kong protests of 2019. Everybody's on the regression line, meaning past exposure to Hong Kong is a good guide for how much you're affected by this current crisis in Hong Kong. Only places that usually worry about Hong Kong also worry about the Hong Kong protests, and nobody else. Contrast that with the Fukushima disaster. So so the R squared, so this regression line, the yellow line explains 94% of the variation on the left and explains only 28% of the variation on the right. So basically on the right, what you see is like a nuclear power plant blows up in Japan, and the pattern of transmission is completely irregular. Meaning, past exposure to Japan is a very bad guide to who is now affected by this crisis. Now, what you can do, using also the software tools I'll mention later, is you can now go and look at like, why are German firms so far above the 45-degree line? And you read like the few pieces of text that generate this dot. And the answer is, and interestingly, this is a rise. Why is the R squared so low? What this means is that lots of companies that do no business with Japan whatsoever and never talk about Japanese risk, all of a sudden are talking about Japanese risk to their businesses. Why? Well, because this power plant blowing up in Japan is ending nuclear power in Germany. So even the nuclear power firms in Germany and France that have nothing whatsoever to do with Japan all of a sudden are affected by this. And this goes to a deeper point. So we have in international finance this notion of contagion, which means sometimes firms that really have nothing to do with a faraway place are affected by what's happening in that place. And basically what you get out of this exercise is that interdependencies across borders, particularly during crisis times, are kind of complicated. Just knowing who sells to whom is not a great guide for who will be affected by a given crisis. And so here, and this is kind of an early warning system for the IMF. Yeah? So what should the IMF worry about? The IMF should worry about crises that have high global impact and an irregular pattern of transmission. Low R squared and high impact. So here's, and this is now old, like we did this in the first quarter of 2022, and people were like, wow, you can quantify the effects of the Ukraine war, okay? So you can do this right away because essentially like okay, so basically what do you see here? This is the transmission of risk, so Russian risk in the first quarter of 22 over normal Russian risk, and it's like off the scale, okay? Like people are much, much more worried about Russia now than they were even in 2014, like, and you see that by like, okay, boom. But, the beta is kind of, so it's mainly countries that usually worry about Russia that are affected. And you can also look, and this is no longer so surprising, but in the first quarter of 2022, you could go and look at like, why are Italian firms so worried? Well, okay, it's all about gas supply. You can do this also, okay, so now all of my dots here are about countries because that's a good way of summarizing, but you can also do it by sector. Yeah, so the underlying data is at the firm level. So I can just say, okay, so which firms in which country are affected, or I can say which firms in which industries are interested in basic materials and energy. Okay. So let me see what else I can cover. So this is basically a way, yeah. Let me show you one more example, which is also kind of useful for policymakers. You have a financial crisis in Italy, Luigi, 2011. People were worried about Italian default once more. But this is sort of one where like, if you're a regulator and you're looking at this, it might make your blood pressure drop again. Why? So remember I said I can group this by sector, I can group the dots by sector or by country, or I can do by country and sector at the same time. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you the spillovers of the Italian sovereign debt crisis in 2011 to foreign firms, and you see like all non-financial firms are the squares. So non-financial firms are chilling on the 45-degree line. They're actually like super low blood pressure, don't care about Italy. Who was really worked up about Italy? Financial firms in France, Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and Israel, and you can guess why, right? Because they bought sovereign bonds from Italy. Okay, so this basically gives like, and this is kind of the IMF people like this, you can basically now characterize as soon as like the crisis happens in that same quarter, you look at the calls and you can now characterize the pattern of transmission. So there's 4 variables that I kind of sort of snuck in my discussion. That's why I showed you so many pictures. So the first is you can measure systematically how severe is the crisis, how severely is this crisis affecting foreigners. You can look at the degree of bilateral transmission, you can look at the regularity of the transmission, and you can, because it's at the firm level and I can run fancy regressions, you can estimate whether or not there is disproportionate financial transmission or non-financial transmission. So you say, this all might sound not so exciting, but like we weren't able to do any of these things with numbers before. So what is, so I've just shown you, I've just put a bunch, so what are the crises with the biggest global impact in our sample? Start of COVID, start of global financial crisis, Fukushima disaster, the Trump trade war. This is why everybody's shaking in their boots for another U.S. default episode, right? So this was the last time we had like a debt ceiling fight. And when you sort of see like the big crises that affect everyone are really coming from the centers of the world economy. Grexit referendum, blah, 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 Brexit. Okay, now we're going for the Crimean crisis. Now, I think the current Russian one would probably be much more up here. Okay, so you get an idea. It also kind of gives you a way of showing, what is the pattern. Well, the COVID pandemic really wasn't a financial crisis at all, right? So this is like a negative number here. It's less financial transition, more real transmission. The Greek sovereign debt crisis, definitely financial transmission. Brexit referendum, financial transmission, and so on. Yeah? So you can basically assess the global impact of crises as they're ongoing. Okay, so then let me maybe show you like one, actually I'll take some questions and I'm going to show you one more application. Yeah?
The negative sign meant that it was less than usual.
A positive number means disproportionate financial transmission, and negative number means disproportionate non-financial transmission, right? So I see which foreign firms are worried about you, and I can say, is it on balance more financial or more non-financial? Okay. So now, as you can imagine, there's been many different applications of this kind of work in different areas of research. Let me just show you one thing. So in international finance, there was a long-standing puzzle so this was called the push-pull model of capital flows. So in international finance, we want to understand why is capital flowing from one country to another. So that's the left-hand side variable here is the total inflows of capital into country C in quarter T. And on the right-hand side are a bunch of variables that we generated. Remember my global risk variable, the blue line that I showed you? So what this here says is that when global risk is high, capital flows to all countries dry up. So in times of crisis, people bring their money home and they stop investing abroad. That sort of makes sense. So there's a long-standing puzzle in the literature where people were then kind of running regressions and like, okay, let's have this variable together with GDP growth or any information about the receiving country. And basically, there's whole papers written about, we can't find any variables that are about country C at time T that beat out this variable at all. In other words, the conventional wisdom was that global perceptions of the global economy were more important for capital flows to Argentina than what's actually happening in Argentina. So now, as it turns out, that using our measures, you can also measure and separate perceptions of global risk from perceptions of country-specific risk. And when you do that, it actually turns out that there's a massive effect of how risky investors think your country are on how much money you want to put in that country. So it actually turns out there are local variables that are strongly correlated with capital flows, and that's the variables that we just generated, the variables of how risky is your country. Okay, so now once you, once you kind of like control for global and country-specific perceptions of risk, all of the classic variables like GDP growth basically don't do much. And here's a specification where you kind of separate the effect of like, are people happy or sad about the stuff happening in your country from how risky do people think your country is. So here's a picture of that. What's kind of interesting, you don't need to follow this whole thing. let me just kind of say, like let me kind of split out one thing. Is remember, I can measure the perceptions of a given country's riskiness. Sorry, I can separate how risky do financial firms think a country is from how risky do non-financial firms think a country is. Which one do you think is more important? So the perceptions of financial firms turned out to be much more important. And you can see that here. I'm running a regression of total inflows into country C at time t. Yeah, so how much inflow of capital is there into a given country? And now I'm putting in simultaneously the risk perceptions by financial firms and the risk perceptions by non-financial firms. And what you see is that really what's much more associated with these outcomes is how risky, so there's more stars on the perceptions of financial firms as opposed to non-financial firms. And this becomes more, so total capital inflows is a bunch of different stuff. That's things like foreign direct investment, bank loans, and so forth. But it's also purchase of stocks and bonds. Purchase of stocks and bonds is often called hot money because those are the things that you can withdraw from the country very quickly, right? So that part of capital flows that is very fickle, we can call that's called portfolio flows, portfolio investments in the given country. And what you see here is, once I look at portfolio flows, it's only the risk perceptions of financial firms that seem to matter, which makes some sense, I guess. Okay. Let me show you one last thing, and then I'll conclude. And I'm going to. I apologize. I'm going to like skip over this like pretty mercilessly. What am I going to do? Okay. Okay. So now I'm doing something completely different. My regressions so far were at the country time level. Now I'm going to get some data from all of my global firms and look at how much are they investing at every point in time. So I have a data set that is at the firm time level, and I'm looking at how much is each firm investing. And so what I'm doing here is I'm running a regression of firm investment, so investment by firm I at time t, on two variables. One is how risky do managers and investors at that firm think that the firm is. So I'm taking the earnings call transcript from that firm in that quarter, and I'm counting how often do they say risk or uncertainty. And what you find is that if they say risk or uncertainty quite a lot in the call, they invest less. The more you talk about risk in the call, the lower is investment. Now what's important, like for the nerds, there's also firm fixed effects in this regression. So I'm using only variation within a given firm over time. So I'm taking out all differences between, countries where there's a lot of investment, countries where there's almost no investment, and so forth. Even after controlling for risk perceptions at the firm level, foreigners' perceptions of your country's riskiness still is strongly associated with how much investment is happening in firms in that country. So in other words, if I look at Turkish firms and I look only at their transcripts and measure how risky do they think they are, that is only half of what's happening. There's a real sense in which the perceptions by global investors of how risky Turkey is, not that specific firm, but how risky Turkey is, seems to be associated with this outcome quite a lot. Yeah? So this is kind of consistent with what policymakers often say, that the perceptions of global financial firms seem to be affecting what's going on in emerging markets, even after holding constant what the emerging markets think is happening themselves. Why would this be? Well, if these global investors are important for things like stock prices, currency depreciation, and so on, then it makes total sense that firms in emerging markets are going to have a tougher time getting funding, holding constant how risky they think they are, if foreign investors think they're risky. Yeah, so it's important that foreign investors think for your allocation. And this is kind of like, this specification here is kind of fun. Like I'm doing a horse race between financial firms' perceptions of how risky your country is and risk perceptions of your own country by firms that are in the same industry as you are, right? So I'm kind of looking at investment at a Turkish cement manufacturer, and I'm looking at conversations by US financial firms, that is very strongly associated with how much that Turkish cement manufacturer is investing. Whereas if I look at risk perceptions of Turkey among other cement manufacturers that are not in Turkey, that seems to have no effect. Yeah, so this just goes to show that financial firms have a special role for the allocation of capital around the world, and that, interacts with a bunch of ways of how we want to think about how we conceptualize and write models about the world economy. Okay, so to conclude, so measuring country risk at the micro level is really key to understanding its sources and transmission. If you kind of have this, remember the star of the show, country risk ICT, if you have the star of the show, you can systematically identify when is a country in crisis and see how is that crisis being transmitted to foreign firms. These transmission patterns change suddenly and significantly during crises. Different crises are transmitted in different ways. And increases in perceived country risk, particularly by foreign financial firms, are associated with significant falls in local asset prices, capital outflows, and reductions in firm-level investment and employment. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.